Well, it's good to be with you. The North Alabama Conference, actually, the Unstuck group and your conference, we've had a number of overlaps through the years, whether it's related to the content we're delivering or the churches within your conference that we've had the opportunity to serve. So we're grateful for this opportunity today to speak to your 2021 annual conference. We at the Unstuck group have the opportunity to serve many different churches across the country, really across the world. And even in these last 12 months of the pandemic, we've had the opportunity to serve churches, not only here in the US, but Canada and in the UK as well. And it's really churches of different shapes and sizes. So right now, at the present time, we're working with many churches, smaller churches, under a couple hundred in attendance, and then many churches too that reach into the thousands. And so our hope is in today's session that wherever you are as a church, that the content speaks to your current place and it helps you consider your next steps as a ministry. Today, the focus of our session is going to be getting discipleship unstuck. It's actually one of the areas that we help a number of churches with. And joining me for today's conversation are really two of my best friends, but they also happen to be teammates at the Unstuck group. First of all, let me introduce Mark Meyer. Mark is our Director of Church Revitalization. And Mark, I was trying to think through how many years you've been with us now at the Unstuck group.
Yeah, it's just over 7 years now, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. And Mark, because of his role with church revitalization, does quite a bit of work with the smaller churches that we get to serve. Of course, there's a whole team of people that help us in that endeavor. But Mark, any guess to how many churches that you've worked with through the years?
Let's say 146 smaller churches. How about that? I'm just throwing that out as a number.
Yeah, it may not be exactly
12, give or take 12 or 13, something like that, maybe. Yeah.
It may not be exactly 146, but I'm sure it's well over 100 now at this point. And then also joining me today is Amy Anderson. Amy is our Director of Consulting, and her team of consultants is probably a dozen or more consultants. They're the group that are serving churches around the world. And Amy, I think did you just pass 5 years on our team? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I have been
closing in on
role
that
as a director for 5 years, and then I was a contractor for a year before that. So I actually have 6 in total. And I just added it up the other day because we were doing a podcast on staffing and structure. And so I know I've helped 130 churches with their staffing and structure issues, and probably served about 150 total as well. So it's a big number. I have a little map on my wall with the dots of all the churches I've worked with. And it's pretty fun to think how God has taught me so much by working with different churches across the country.
Well, these two, again, they're good friends, but they're also very sharp. And I think you're going to enjoy some of their thoughts on this really important topic for the health of churches. But today, as I mentioned, it's all about getting discipleship unstuck. And what we have found is many churches that find themselves stuck, it's because they don't have a clear discipleship strategy. In fact, it's one of the top 5 reasons that we see. You may be curious what the other 4 are. So not having a clear discipleship strategy is maybe one of the tops on the list. Not having clear vision is second. Being complex. And so think about complex programming and complexity around decision making. Not empowering leaders. And this not only goes for lay leaders, but also just empowering pastors to live out the wiring that God has placed into them to serve their churches and their communities. And then finally, it's really about becoming, over time, unfortunately, we see churches become inward focused rather than outward focused. And certainly this causes churches to get stuck as well. But let me share this screen with you because it highlights what we see in the churches that are reaching out to us. This is a picture of the life cycle of a church. And you can see it's broken down into 7 different phases, from launch to momentum growth, strategic growth, to sustained health, maintenance, preservation, and then finally life support. And The numbers that you're seeing, the percentages that you're seeing come from now more than 15,000 churches that have taken the Unstuck Church assessment. In fact, even prior to today's event, you may have had an opportunity to engage that assessment with your church team, your lay leaders and your staff leaders at your churches. And based on the results of that, you may know where your church fits in on this life cycle. And if you haven't had a chance to take the assessment yet, it's a free assessment, and we'll make sure you get a link so that you can take that with your team. But as you can see, based on everybody, all the churches that have taken our assessment, about 85% of churches actually land on the declining side, the right side of this church life cycle. And as you can see, the largest percentage, over 60%, are in this maintenance season of the life cycle. And as I mentioned, and one of the obvious questions that pops up, and frequently I'm being asked as I write about and talk about why churches get stuck, it's why? Why is it? Why is it that churches find themselves in this place? And as I suggested, one of the primary reasons is churches just haven't clarified their discipleship strategy. And so they find themselves in this place of either maintenance or preservation or life support. And so I think many churches just engage ministry like they've always engaged ministry. And they're encouraging people to show up for Sunday services and classes and events and all good things. But because there isn't really a defined spiritual formation strategy in the church, people end up showing up, but they don't end up becoming more like Jesus. And what many churches have learned, unfortunately, is just keeping people busy at church doesn't actually help them grow in their faith. And so, Mark, I want to begin with you this afternoon. You work with a number of small churches, as I suggested earlier. What are some of the indicators that these churches haven't yet clarified their discipleship strategy?
Yeah, well, as you know, there's a big part of what we do is we check out what they actually do on a Sunday. It used to be pre-pandemic that we travel and do that in person, and we've been watching these online as well. But there's just such a heavy focus on that Sunday morning worship service. And when probably my biggest observation when I'm working with churches, the number one thing that comes up over and over and over again is that the language that's being used, the delivery method, how we're teaching, it is clearly directed toward Christ followers already. And there's just not a sense and even easy handles for someone that is kicking the tires on the faith or spiritually curious for them to even understand what's being done. So there's a high focus of discipleship that's there on Sundays. The other thing we'll see is if there's not a lack of alignment around a strategy, what tends to happen is that we'll see these committees we have a missions committee that they're trying to figure out their own thing of what they're doing. And then we have our youth committee and they're trying to do their thing. And our kids ministry, they've got their ways and activities that they're doing. And there just becomes this sprawl of that activity like you talked about. And they really become ministry silos that are disconnected from any real unified effort of what we're trying to get people to do and what we're trying to get them to move to. And as a result of that, this is one key component I think that gets lost in this is that we're to go make disciples. And so the invite and new people coming through the doors is lost in our discipleship process as well. And so we're not reaching new people. Some of the clear indicators just from the numbers, we see first-time guests plummet, or there's just simply not enough new people coming through the door. Well, that means that we're not inviting our friends and those that are in the life of the church don't have a mindset to be walking with people and helping them in their spiritual journey. And then as a result, also baptisms or professions of faith, those numbers are in decline or almost non-existent. And some of it just from experience and just talking to people, what I just think about the guest that's walking through the door. Many have just communicated that they come in and it's as if they have to kind of slide in, and it's just hard for them to get handles on how to get connected. And it's just intimidating because there's not a clear strategy. So those are some of the leading indicators that I see that there's not a strategy in place with several churches that I've worked with.
It's funny you mentioned committees. Maybe not funny, maybe that's the wrong word, but when we look back at our research, churches that are in decline actually have twice as many committees as churches that are healthy and thriving and growing. And so I think sometimes we think if something's broken, we need to get a committee behind that. But as you suggested, sometimes that just pulls the team out of alignment even more, and it helps to maybe not get this focus or clarity that we're starting to look for. Amy, I know you tend to work with larger churches, but are the challenges similar for these churches?
Yeah, I think everything that Mark just said, there's a lot of similarity with large churches that don't have their discipleship pathway defined. But one that really stood out to me on that lack of alignment is the ministry silos that happen. When we don't have clarity around our discipleship path, then everyone just gets busy with their personal ministry, their pet ministry. And when this is in place, when I assess the structure, it's usually that they have different owners across the spectrum. Groups is over here, first impressions over here, something called discipleship over here, women's groups, men's group. And so when they have that spread, I know they do not have a defined path, because when you do, you have a defined leader to lead that path. So in big churches, because they have more staff, I can see the misalignment when they show me their org chart. And another big symptom that I see at large churches, and maybe this is true small, you hinted at it, Mark, but there's just lots of activities. There's lots of programs, there's lots of events, there's a lot of classes, and then they're overstaffed because they're relying on staff to run all those programs, events, and classes. And because of that, they don't have very many high-level volunteers in place, because the staff is really doing the ministry and getting a lot of people engaged and busy. But again, it doesn't have an end. So that's what I see in the bigger churches.
Yeah, and again, I think the distinction when we're talking about high level lay people and folks that are volunteering and engaging ministry like that, they're actually doing the ministry rather than being on these committees. That is a key distinction that we see. All right, so the challenge is churches tend to get stuck around discipleship. And so today we want to offer 3 solutions. I hope these are very practical for you to consider if you're sensing your church is stuck when it comes to defining a clear discipleship strategy as well. And the first solution is this: we need to shift from programs to a path. And maybe to illustrate this, let me share this diagram with you. It will hopefully give you a clear picture of what I have in mind here. And actually, Amy just alluded to this a little bit. What this shows is it's just 2 different churches. And from the outside looking in, these 2 churches look very similar. But once you open the door and see what's happening in these 2 different churches, they look very different. And you can see the church on the left is actually, I think, probably the more common church that we walk into. And there you can see there are a number of great ministries that are happening in this church. Men's ministry, women's ministry, singles, students, Awana, seniors ministry, and on and on and on. And by the way, any one of these ministries on their own, I'm sure have the potential of helping someone move from where they are to where God wants them to be. That's not the challenge. The challenge is this: think especially of the new person connecting to your church, or the person who maybe is new to the faith and they're just trying to figure out what their next step toward Christ would look like. When you have all of these different ministries, what ends up happening oftentimes is they start competing with each other for people's time, for people's attention, and especially then for the new person trying to figure out their next step. It becomes very confusing because all of these competing ministries want them to connect to their ministry, to go to their event, to serve on their teams. And as a result of that, there's this challenge for the new person, or again, anybody trying to consider their next step. It becomes challenging for them to understand, this is where I go next. And so this Contrary is the second church. And this church, as you can see, there's a clear path that they've identified. This is just one example. So being a part of our worship gatherings, then serving, getting on a serving team, then connecting with a smaller group of people in a Bible study or a home group or a Sunday school class, and then investing in people in your neighborhood, using all that God's put in you to actually develop relationship, and then encouraging other people to take their next steps toward Christ as well. Now, we see different paths. They usually have some common features of the one that I'm highlighting here. But the key difference is, rather than having all of these different ministries that are trying to compete with each other for people's time and attention, what we're seeing in churches that are really seeing that spiritual development happening in their folks, they have this clear path, these clear next steps identified to help people understand, I'm here today, but as I try to become more like Jesus, this is the next step that my church is encouraging me to take. What's interesting is there's actually been a lot of research done around this very topic. And a number of years ago, it was actually Willow Creek Community Church, through their Reveal study, ended up looking at, I think it was well over 1,000 churches and several 100,000 Christ followers, because what they wanted to figure out is what's happening in the churches that are really encouraging spiritual formation to take place, and how does that differ from churches that are struggling when it comes to spiritual growth. And there's a book that was written by Greg Hawkins and Callie Parkinson that kind of took all of the data, all of the learnings from that research, and then helped us get a glimpse of maybe the best practices, if you will, in the churches where spiritual formation was happening. This is one of the quotes that grabbed my attention from this book. Greg and Callie wrote this: "Unfortunately, churches often make things harder by obscuring the goal, which is to become more like Christ, with a complicated assortment of activities. And when the church incessantly promotes all the things that people should do, it's very easy for them to lose sight of the real goal, which is who they should become." And again, this is just confirming some of the things that Amy and Mark have shared already, that churches can tend to keep people very busy, but that's not necessarily helping people become more like Jesus. So, Amy, if people aren't becoming more like Jesus, why don't churches just change their discipleship strategy? Why isn't that happening?
Well, I think we could say that churches tend to do what they've always done. Historically, the churches, the ones I've worked with and seen, we aren't good at stopping things and starting new things. In fact, I think COVID has been a huge challenge for churches because we didn't have any research and development muscles, creativity muscles, thinking about new strategies and new ways of trying to accomplish the ultimate goal. And Tony, I think you've said it this way. You've said the way we do church becomes more important than why we do church. In other words, methods, the ways that we do it start to supersede the actual mission that we're on. And so I really think we just have to take a step back, and we need to clarify the when. We have to put language around what you were saying in that quote, is to become more like Jesus. And it brings me back to what Jesus said and told the disciples. I'm just going to read this. He said, "I've been given all authority in heaven and on earth. So therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Now that's a clear win, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus was crystal clear to the disciples what their mission was. And honestly, most churches, that's your mission. You might word it a little bit differently, but that's what we're all trying to do. But we can't start creating programming and events and activities until we've clarified the when. I did this when I was leading at my church. We had a large auditorium. And so I got calls all the time to host Christian concerts. And I would go, but why? What would the when be? I could fill up my auditorium with Christ followers from across the Twin Cities here in Minnesota, but is that really me helping us help our church become more like Jesus? And so, I always said no, but don't try to change the strategies or your methods until you first agree on what the win looks like. define what you want that outcome to be, and then determine your best strategies, your best methods to accomplish the win.
That's good, Amy. Mark, I'm hoping maybe you could share a story, because I think the shift is really challenging. Shifting our church from being a church with a number of programs to organizing our discipleship strategy more around a path. Have you worked with a church that has made this transition?
Yeah, well, thankfully, it's part of our core process when we're working with churches is to really spend time in this discipleship. And just asking the question, it's like, great, we have somebody new that comes in and they know little to nothing, right? And then something happens over 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and someday that we're hoping that they're going to become this disciple of Jesus. Well, what does a disciple even look like? And Amy, what you're talking about, defining the win.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is it that we're actually looking at in that life change that happens? And so from beginning to that, not that it's an ending process in discipleship, but that's the essence of a church, I think, is what happens in that in between. So we'll look at the different programs. There's a church in a United Methodist Church in Pennsylvania that I worked with this calendar year. There's a new upstart United Methodist Church in Florida that we've implemented a very similar path or process. And I'll just kind of walk through these. Tony, you referenced an example like this, but I think they're great. And for smaller churches, don't overcomplicate it. Keep it easy and keep it simple. What are the core essentials of what we need? So having a great, I'll use the word experience sometimes. Sometimes we use the word worship as one of those key components. Not only, as we mentioned, for the Christ Follower, but we would actually have that dialed in to where we're really thinking about a new guest is going to be there, someone that doesn't understand what we're talking about. That's a great step. Somehow, some way, we need to get people connected to people. There's been research that's been done that people need to get connected with at least 7 people in the first 6 months in the life of a church for them to kind of stick and kind of start getting some traction. That sounds like a long time to me. I would hope that that's happened in 6 weeks or 12 weeks, but how do we do that? And so groups, we just want you to get connected with people, find a group. So often we may have groups or those Sunday school classes. I would encourage them, make sure that you have some type of setting where a new person or someone, again, exploring faith can connect there and not feel intimidated or overwhelmed in doing that. In one of those secret shopper things, and Amy, we've had a chance to do some of those secret shoppers together.
We've had some fun ones, yeah.
We have. So I like to just kind of play ignorant, and I asked, what are those classes or what are those things that you have? And it's like, oh, it'd be great. I think you should go to the one that's the study of the life of Paul. I just asked the woman, who's Paul? Just for the experience, but kind of what happens there. But we have these offerings and groups that they could just be like our Sunday mornings, where they're very churchy, or such a leap for someone new to get connected. So can we get them connected to a group? Certainly give, practicing generosity, our hearts connected to our money, and they can start taking small steps there. That's great. Serving, find a place to serve. My brother-in-law mentioned to me, Mark, one of the most impactful things for me in serving is that we had chairs that were loose. And so I went in the evenings and put a bracket on 438 chairs and fixed them. And I found that to be one of the most fulfilling things that I've ever done. He felt that he contributed, so we discount some of those areas that people can serve and find great fulfillment. There's something about our hands and feet being engaged in the mission that changes us from the inside out. And then the book Move that Tony referenced, the data and the research would say that serving actually moves people more in that faith journey than being part of a Sunday school class or even a group. Not that those aren't important. So those are 4 great things. Then the 5th, again, comes back to invite. Encouraging people, are you building relationships outside the 4 walls? Who are you walking with? But if we just have those 5, those are 5 common things that we work with and developing the path. And that's an example of what we've done in just some recent churches this year.
Can I just jump in for a second, Tony?
Yeah, please do that, Amy.
When you talk about inviting and some of the things that we get a little bit habituated to, like go to the study on the life of Paul. the churches aren't thinking that you don't know Paul. That's a really good example. But when you actually invite someone to church, like if you, I remember I invited my brother to our church all the time, and he finally came. I'll have to say, when you have someone who's not connected to Christ, not connected to the church, and you invite them, you will see your church differently. You will hear your church differently. You might even smell your church differently. Like all your antennas are up when you're inviting someone that you love to come and experience this, and hoping that they'd hear a word, they'd feel a nudge, a prompt towards Christ. But that's the best way, I think, sometimes to really identify where are we missing it with new people. Bring a new person.
It's funny you mentioned smell. I remember this is when my son was very young. We walked into a church and we were going through their fellowship hall. And again, when kids are small, there's no filter. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of blurted out loud, "Dad, this place smells like a bathroom."
Oh, no.
I mean, with that fresh perspective, mean, you're right. When you start to invite friends, you just look at the whole experience a lot differently. Mm-hmm. All right. So that's the first solution. The second solution is to consider the entire spiritual journey. And this is what I mean by that. Let me share my screen again. A number of months ago, I just went back and considered my own spiritual journey. And it began at a place where, frankly, I just wasn't interested in faith, not interested in the church at all. Through a whole series of experiences, though, that I won't dive into, I started asking some spiritual questions, some big faith questions, and moved from this place of being not interested to being spiritually curious. And then there were a number of people in my life at that point that helped me understand the answers to those questions that I was asking. They helped me open scripture for the very first time. They helped me understand who Jesus was and the sacrifice that he made for me. And as a result of those conversations, I moved from being spiritually curious to becoming a new believer in Jesus. And then this is where Methodist kicked in. I actually, once I became a new believer, joined a local United Methodist church back in Ohio. And through that process, started to be discipled, where people helped me understand what my relationship with Christ was all about, and helped me consider the next steps that I needed to be taking in my faith as well. To the point today where I have recognized what Jesus has done in my life, in my marriage, in my parenting, with my purpose, everything that I do. I want others to experience that as well. So I've moved from this place of not just being discipled, but trying to be a disciple maker, because I want others to experience the same relationship with Jesus that I've experienced. And what we've seen, though, in working with churches, is oftentimes, rather than thinking about this entire spiritual journey, most of what churches do, think about worship services or Sunday school classes or home groups or any part of what they might say is their discipleship strategy, is really just focused on steps 3 and 4 in the process. And so what I want you to consider here in this second solution is, what would our strategy look like for discipleship if, rather than waiting until believers show up on Sunday morning, we took a broader perspective and started considering the spiritual journey from someone who's not interested in faith all the way through to the place where they're becoming disciple makers and helping others take those next steps toward Christ as well. So, Mark, I think this is a particular challenge for smaller traditional churches. How do you encourage them to engage people all along that faith journey?
Well, that's been so helpful. And Tony, when you showed that fourth stage of being discipled, my observation and sense is that I just believe millions of Christ followers are stuck in that stage. And these are great people. They love Jesus. They're in Sunday school classes. They're showing up at services, but there's comfort there and familiarity. And I believe that we have millions that are in that. And that last connection from step 4 to 5 is a really difficult step. And I think a lot of that's fear-based. And we've, I don't know that I can talk about my faith. And we have images of people being on street corners, and I'm supposed to be the person with the blowhorn that's doing this, or, talking about Jesus in a grocery shopping line and comparing them to peanut butter somehow. I don't know. It's just, we have this, this gap, and we've really overcomplicated. And I absolutely love small churches. And this is, I believe, a game changer that, small churches tend to compare themselves to large churches by these programs or facilities. This is all about relationship. And
That's
relationship is so key. And what an advantage that all you need to, as a small church, if we can focus on the relationship component, not only of those that are here, but extending that out to those who aren't here in those immediate circles. That's the secret sauce that Jesus had intended, I believe, from day one, for us to do. And so removing that barrier to simplify that and say, who are the 3 to 5 people that God has put in your life for whatever reason, that are crossing your paths, that you're normally connecting with, that maybe as a step of obedience, like, just let's start spending time with them. I like to say this too for the introverts. Sometimes introverts think that, we get a pass. Thank goodness God created the extroverts, because, they're the ones that got to do all that work and like go get people in here somehow. And I can just do my thing. This is the way that God wired me. And well, as a fellow introvert, I get to speak and say, no, I'm not going to pass either. That I believe that God's put 3 to 5 people in my life, and just simplifying it, that those people probably are already crossing the paths of every single person in the life of your church, and let's help them connect the dots. Creating environments where people can take a step that's not into the life of the church, and environments is a way that the church can help that. Just this past week, I thought it was a great idea that part of those groups that we talked about, they're having an intentional time where they just open it up, that they just have a big barbecue. They hang out with their normal group, but it's bring your friends. We're going to just, serve a bunch of food, hang out, meet new people. It's done at someone's home. It's what a great, easy way to meet new people, to have a serve event that is, we're stuffing backpacks at a school, but we're alongside people that we haven't met, that we get to build a relationship and connect with them and serve together, creating some of those easy places that we can actually invite people to that aren't necessarily inside the 4 walls of the church, could be really helpful. And again, from a simple perspective, a great example, Dave and John Ferguson, this is brothers and a pastor of Community Christian Church in Chicago. They talked about this bless concept, but the B, begin with prayer. And I try to do this in my own life, God, who are these 3 to 5 people that you naturally have crossed into my life? And how can I start praying for them? And weird things start to happen with that prayer, I believe. You get the random text message. The L is listen to them. We sometimes have this agenda that we feel that we want to communicate a lot of information. Let's just be great listeners. What's going on in their life, and ask questions and just sit back and really genuinely get to know people. The E stands for eat with them. I like food. So it's what a great excuse. There's something sacramental about food, though, sharing a meal across the table. Amy, you shared a story one time that really stuck with me, of someone that had invited their friend to church over and over again. Hey, come to church with me. Hey, come to church with me, over and over. And that person looked at them and said, you've invited me to church over and over and over again, but you've never invited me to your home. And I thought that was just such a powerful story, that as we're connecting and hanging out with people, it's just that we would share a meal with them and invite them to our home. The S is serve them. What are needs in their life? What are simple acts of help with their kids, or what they may need, and just to be listening and attentive in there. And at some point, you may get the opportunity to share your story of this relationship that you have in Jesus and how it's been a game changer. So we've overcomplicated it. And, for smaller churches, relationships, if you can expand that relationship component, that could be an absolute game changer in the life of your church.
That's great. It's very good. I love that model too from the Fergusons. And it just, for me, it helps those of us who are disciple makers understand clearly this is the mission that God's not only called our church to, but this is who he's called each of us as Christ followers to this mission as well. And it just puts practical handles on what it is to really live out the faith that God's called us in our daily lives, within our neighborhood, with our coworkers, with our friends. This is that opportunity to live out faith. So, Amy, Mark just spoke of some examples of how churches encourage disciple makers to reach people. What are some other strategies you're seeing churches engage as it relates to connecting with people throughout this spiritual journey?
Yeah, Mark, you kind of lingered on that 5 being that disciple maker and inviting others. I'm going to jump to the other end of that spiritual engagement journey, the not interested and the spiritually curious. For years, our weekend services really were the big front door. I would say when I was on staff at our church that our weekend experience was the main front door to introduce people to faith and to God. And we designed an experience that was a very comfortable place for people outside the church. But things have shifted now and they've changed. And so, Tony, I think I would talk about a digital ministry strategy for those not interested, spiritually curious, because the first place that most people are going to experience your church now is something in the digital space. If you've done that building relationships, with people, great churches right now are creating content that is easily shareable in their social media spaces, like on Facebook. Sometimes it's just short teaching things. Sometimes it's something funny. Sometimes it's a Facebook group for parents trying to get through COVID with their kids, but it's easily shareable and the content is relevant. So if you think of someone outside that church before they've met Jesus, as you were talking about before, Mark, what are the real needs in their life? Well, let's create content, because all truth is God's truth, that's relevant and will provide some help to their life in some way. If they engage with that, they are going to probably look for more content from you because it was something that was helpful. But here's the key, a couple keys actually. One is that content won't get to those people in your life unless you share it. And so we have to have congregations that are on mission, that are those disciple makers, that level 5, that are excited to share the content with people. I often use the word carriage. That's how these products will get carried to other people. But the other important thing then is that you as church leaders, you have to create great content that's trustworthy, that people know I can share this because I'm trusting that our church is doing a good job of putting that together. Just like if you want to invite someone to your church service, if actually going to the gathering, if people don't feel that service is going to connect with their friends that are outside the faith or not be comfortable, they won't invite them. Likewise, if you create content that's overly churchy or pointed more towards disciple making overtly, they're probably not going to, they'll consume it, but they probably won't share that with the people in that not interested in spiritual curious space. So if you have to decide what's our main strategy to reach people in that first box, those not interested, if it's the invite strategy, go towards digital content and make sure you have a weekend service that's designed with the new person in mind. So I guess that's where I'll land that one, Tony.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. That's helpful, Amy. So those are the first 2 solutions. Let me finish with this third solution. As you're thinking about your discipleship strategy at your church, consider the catalyst of faith. And by that, I mean, first, consider what God has used in your life to help grow your faith. And this may be a fun exercise that you can do. I've done this several times with people. I've passed out 5 different Post-it notes to each individual. And I've asked them to share one Post-it note. What's one catalyst that God's used to grow your faith? And so then I have everybody submit their 5 Post-it notes, and then we group them according to similarities. And what I have found is there are some consistent themes that come out through that exercise. It's just, by the way, it's just a fun exercise to hear others' spiritual journeys too. We don't oftentimes share that. And I think it's a great way to learn not only how God has grown someone else's faith, but just to get to know other people in our lives too. So it's a great exercise. You may want to do it with your team at your churches. What's interesting in that exercise, Mark alluded to it a moment ago, the catalyst that's most often mentioned in that exercise is other people. It's relationships with other people. But what I've learned there are some common themes, and let me share my screen so that you can see this. Because we have found, as we've done that exercise and had conversations with a number of different groups related to discipleship, we have found that there are these 5 spiritual catalysts that often pop up, and I'm going to share a 6th in a moment. So teaching, just learning from God's word, that's a key catalyst. Mark also talked about serving other people, and he shared the story of his brother-in-law who found that to be very compelling to help them kind of look at their faith a little bit differently. And I know for me personally, serving others has been a key to my spiritual formation as well. Connecting with others. So this is that real relationship development where we're not only getting to know other people, but other people are encouraging us, challenging us to consider our next steps toward Christ, reaching other people. So developing relationships and sharing our story, sharing how Jesus has changed our life and encouraging others to take their next step toward Christ, and becoming generous. And the reason why we use this is actually, I'm giving you a sneak peek at one of the exercises we use in our Unstuck process to help churches like yours define their discipleship strategy. And what we have learned is around each of these 5 catalysts, churches can create environments, strategies. They can teach on these things to encourage people in their church to take their next steps toward Christ. Now, I mentioned there's a 6th, and I'm going to just write it over here on the side like this. It's spiritual disciplines. And that is one of those opportunities that we have in our church, and every one of these catalysts to be encouraging people to learn how to read God's word, to study God's word, to pray, fasting, and so on. All of those spiritual disciplines, which I'm suspecting have been so important to you in your faith journey. The challenge in churches, if we're always inviting people to come to the church for their spiritual formation, we run the risk that we're not going to be equipping people to live out the faith, to live out that relationship with Jesus on their own. And they're going to be reliant on what happens at the church rather than engaging those spiritual disciplines, which really going to help them thrive as Christ followers. So this is maybe a conversation that would be helpful for you to consider personally. What are those spiritual catalysts that have shaped who you are as a Christ follower? And then as a result of that, if that is what shaped your faith, how can we create environments and discipleship strategies in our church to be able to see that through in our discipleship ministry as well? So Amy, Mark, I want to thank you for your contributions to today's conversation. We talked about 3 shifts to help you get your discipleship unstuck. The first solution was about shifting from programs to a path. The second solution was about considering the entire spiritual journey from somebody who's not interested in faith all the way through to becoming a disciple maker themselves. And then the third solution I just mentioned is about considering those catalysts of faith, those things that really challenge us to take our next steps toward Christ. And I think a powerful spiritual formation process in any church is going to be a reflection of all 3 of those solutions. So Amy, thank you for joining us today. Mark, thank you for joining us as well. And let me just say again, if we can help you in any way, whether it's related to clarifying your discipleship strategy or any of those other things that we've talked about today to help your church get unstuck, we would love to work with you and your team. And you can reach out to us at theunstuckgroup.com. Thank you for letting us be a part of the conversation today.